They say the dead keep secrets better than the living. But history asks a darker question. What happens when a corpse becomes a weapon, not a metaphor, not a legend, a literal body, sealed, guarded, untouchable, still shaping power centuries after death? What if one corpse, rotting beneath Westminster Abbey, has been protected more fiercely than any living monarch England ever crowned? March 24th, 1603. A woman dies. But this is not the story you were taught. She did not die peacefully in a royal bed, surrounded by prayers and candlelight, slipping gently into history. She died standing up. For days, possibly weeks, she refused to lie down. Her body was held upright by cushions, chairs, servants, and a will that had never learned how to surrender. Her eyes remained open, sometimes unfocused, sometimes staring at corners of the room where no one else could see anything. Her ladies whispered that the Queen had finally lost her reason. Her counsellors whispered something far more dangerous, because if she was no longer in control of herself, England was no longer in control of its future. This woman was Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who stared down the Spanish Armada and survived, the monarch who transformed a divided, impoverished island into a global power. She was 69 years old, and before her body was even cold, the story began to change. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly. The doors were locked. Access was restricted. Only a handful of trusted witnesses were allowed near the body. And within hours, Elizabeth Tudor was sealed inside a lead coffin. Not days, not weeks, hours. That detail matters, because lead coffins are not just ceremonial, they are meant to preserve and to conceal. For over 400 years, Elizabeth's remains have remained sealed beneath Westminster Abbey. No autopsy, no examination, no modern analysis. This is not because the technology does not exist. Royal remains far older than Elizabeth's have been studied, scanned, and tested. Other kings, other queens, other sacred bodies, but not her. Every formal request to examine Elizabeth I's remains has been denied. The official reason is always the same: respect for the dead. But historians quietly note something unsettling. Respect has never stopped the British establishment before. So the question lingers, unspoken but persistent. What are they protecting? This is not a claim that a single secret lies in that coffin. It is something more unsettling than that. The possibility that the myth of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the eternal ruler, the flawless symbol, may depend on never allowing the physical truth of her body to be seen. Because symbols are fragile things. They cannot age. They cannot rot. They cannot bleed. And Elizabeth Tudor did not rule England as a woman. She ruled it as an idea. What you are about to hear is not an accusation, and it is not conspiracy. It is a reconstruction, a psychological and historical inquiry into what happens when a human being is forced to live as a political symbol for nearly half a century. Because whatever killed Elizabeth I was not just illness, or age, or time. It was expectation. It was performance. It was the refusal to ever be seen as human. And whatever was sealed beneath Westminster Abbey in 1603 was not merely a queen. It was the evidence of what that performance costs. To understand how Elizabeth ruled as she did, we must understand how she survived long enough to wear the crown. Because survival, for Elizabeth Tudor, was never natural. It was learned. Elizabeth is not yet 3 years old when her mother, Anne Boleyn, is taken to the scaffold. They do not let the child see the execution, but she hears it. The crowd, the roar, then the silence. History often treats this moment as distant, symbolic, but for a child, it was not abstract. It was the moment Elizabeth learned that love does not protect you. Marriage does not protect you, and being queen does not protect you. Her father, Henry VIII, ruled not by stability, but by appetite. Wives appeared. Wives vanished. Some were divorced. Some were executed. The court learned to read his moods the way sailors read weather. Elizabeth learned faster than most. She learned when to speak. More importantly, when not to. When her mother was erased from history, Elizabeth was erased with her, declared illegitimate, removed from court, reduced from princess to political inconvenience. She did not protest. She did not cry in public. She smiled. She curtsied. She thanked them for their mercy. And she watched. Elizabeth's childhood was not one of affection. It was one of observation. Who survives? Who disappears? Who adapts just enough? She learned that knowledge could be armor, languages, philosophy, theology. If she could not be indispensable as a daughter, perhaps she could be indispensable as a mind. When her brother Edward became king, England lurched violently toward Protestantism. Elizabeth went with it. She attended services. She read the correct scriptures. She gave no one a reason to suspect her. Then Edward died, and her sister Mary took the throne. The pendulum swung again. Catholicism returned violently. Fires burned at Smithfield. Protestants screamed while the city watched. Elizabeth adapted again. She heard Mass. She spoke carefully. She survived, until survival failed. In 1554, Mary imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower of London, the same walls that had once held her mother. This was not just a prison. It was a waiting room for death. Elizabeth knew this. Every stone around her had witnessed final prayers, final regrets, final screams. For 2 months, she lived with uncertainty as a constant companion. Every knock on the door could be the last. She was interrogated repeatedly, asked the same questions, trapped in the same circles. She answered with precision. Never too much, never too little. When pressed, she fell ill. When watched, she was obedient. When accused, she was humble. It was not honesty. It was survival as performance. Historians often ask why Elizabeth was spared. The evidence against her was thin, but that had never stopped an execution before. The answer appears to be this: Elizabeth understood power better than those who questioned her. She made Mary believe that killing her would cause more instability than keeping her alive. So Mary hesitated, and in Tudor England, hesitation saved lives. Elizabeth walked out of the Tower in 1555, but she did not walk out unchanged. The girl who entered had believed survival was temporary. The woman who left understood something far darker. Survival is permanent work. From that point on, Elizabeth never allowed herself to be unguarded, never allowed emotion to outrun calculation, never allowed anyone to see the whole of her. This was not cruelty, it was training. training that would one day allow Elizabeth I to rule for 44 years, and training that would eventually demand a price no human body was meant to pay. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, England believed the danger had passed. It had not. The crown did not make her safe. It made her visible. At 25 years old, Elizabeth I stood at the centre of a kingdom that did not believe a woman could rule alone. From the first days of her reign, the message was relentless and unified. Marry, produce an heir, secure the succession. This was not advice. It was a demand. Parliament insisted. Her council insisted. Foreign ambassadors insisted. A woman, they told her, could not rule without a husband. Elizabeth listened, and then she refused. Publicly, she framed her refusal as choice. Privately, historians still debate what that choice truly was. What mattered was the result. Marriage negotiations became diplomacy. Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire. Elizabeth promised interest without commitment, affection without submission, time without conclusion. Years passed. No marriage. No heir. The danger did not disappear. It evolved. Elizabeth learned that if she could not satisfy expectations, she could replace them. If England demanded a king, she would become something else. A symbol, the Virgin Queen. Not a woman who lacked desire, but a ruler who transcended it. Virginity became ideology. Chastity became authority. Her body became the state. And symbols require consistency. Elizabeth's appearance was not personal expression. It was policy. Her white makeup, Venetian ceruse, was fashionable across Europe. It was also made of lead. At the time, no one understood neurotoxins. They understood only appearances. White skin signaled purity. Agelessness signaled divine favor. Flawlessness signaled strength. Each day, layers were applied. Carefully, ritually. Modern medicine now tells us what chronic lead exposure can cause. Headaches, abdominal pain, muscle weakness, mood instability, confusion. These symptoms appear repeatedly in accounts of Elizabeth's health. No document proves the cause, but the pattern remains. The corset completed the illusion. Rigid, unyielding, engineered to force the body into permanence. Elizabeth wore hers tighter than most, not to be beautiful, but to remain upright, to stand through ceremonies that lasted hours, to endure the gaze of foreign envoys, to appear tireless. The corset was architecture, structural support for a body that was not allowed to fail, because any sign of weakness would be reported by nightfall. Spain would hear of it. France would hear of it. Rome would hear of it. And someone would begin calculating how long England had left. So Elizabeth stood. She smiled. She performed. The mask worked. England stabilized. The economy improved. The realm endured. And beneath the surface, the cost accumulated. Pain became routine. Exhaustion became invisible. Discomfort became background noise. Elizabeth learned to rule while suffering, to decide policy while in pain, to negotiate alliances while her body deteriorated. The mask did not crack. It fused. By middle age, Elizabeth was no longer pretending to be invincible. She was required to be. And once the mask becomes inseparable from the face, removing it is no longer an option, because without it, the symbol collapses, and with it, the human being disappears. This was the bargain Elizabeth made, and it was a bargain her body would eventually refuse to honor. Every performance has a cost. Elizabeth's was paid in flesh. By the 1,580 seconds, the mask no longer floated above her body. It had fused to it. From the outside, Elizabeth I still appeared eternal. Inwardly, the strain was accumulating. Contemporary accounts grow careful during these years. Words soften. Descriptions become indirect. The Queen requires rest. Her Majesty withdraws from court. The Queen is indisposed. But between the lines, a pattern emerges. Elizabeth suffered frequent headaches, abdominal pain, weakness in her limbs. She struggled with stairs. She needed assistance standing after long sittings. Her temper shortened. Her sleep fractured. Modern historians debate the cause. Chronic illness, organ failure, long-term poisoning, the accumulated damage of stress carried for decades. No single diagnosis explains everything, but no serious account denies this. Elizabeth's body was failing, and still she performed. In 1588, England faced its greatest threat, the Spanish Armada, a Catholic empire prepared to invade, depose Elizabeth, and erase Protestant England entirely. Elizabeth was in her mid-50s, likely ill, exhausted, physically diminished, and yet she rode to Tilbury, wearing armour over silk, mounted on a white horse. She addressed her troops with words that would echo for centuries. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It was a perfect performance. What history often forgets is what came before and after. Accounts suggest Elizabeth was so weak that day, she struggled to mount her horse. She was given stimulants, wine, anything to keep her upright. For hours, she was magnificent, and then she collapsed. She did not appear publicly for days afterward. Some say weeks. The victory belonged to England. The cost belonged to her body. The 1,590 seconds were worse. Robert Dudley, the one man she had trusted for decades, died. Elizabeth locked herself away, refused food, refused company. Those closest to her described something breaking. Not politically, personally. She replaced Dudley with younger favourites, men who admired her legend, but did not understand her cost. When the Earl of Essex entered her chambers unannounced, and saw her without wig, without paint, without armour, something shifted. Elizabeth never forgave him. Not because he disobeyed protocol, but because he saw what the mask was hiding. Her health declined sharply afterward. By the turn of the century, Elizabeth had lost most of her teeth. Her speech became difficult. Her breath, according to some private letters, required constant perfumes to mask illness. Her hands trembled. Her eyesight failed. Still, she refused to appear diminished. She wore heavier wigs, thicker makeup, more elaborate gowns. The illusion required escalation. By her final years, the strain was no longer deniable. She stopped eating properly. Her body swelled. Her strength faded. And then came the final act of control. Elizabeth refused to lie down. For days, possibly weeks, she remained upright, seated, supported, defiant. Some believed she feared death. Others believed lying down caused unbearable pain. Perhaps both are true. Or perhaps this was simply the last expression of a lifetime spent refusing surrender. She had survived by standing. She would die the same way. When she finally collapsed, the mask could no longer hold. Elizabeth died on March 24th, 1603, quietly, without revelation, and immediately the performance resumed. Elizabeth I ruled England magnificently. That much is not in question. She preserved the realm. She defeated foreign threats. She stabilized a nation that could easily have torn itself apart. History remembers her as Gloriana, as the Virgin Queen, as something almost untouched by time. But history prefers myths to bodies, and myths require silence. Elizabeth did not rule England as a woman. She ruled it as an idea carefully constructed, carefully maintained, and carefully protected. Because ideas do not age. They do not rot. They do not bleed. Human beings do. Elizabeth's power depended on never being seen as human, never weak, never aging, never failing. So she learned to perform strength. She learned to perform certainty. She learned to perform eternity. And England rewarded her for it. But the reward came with a condition. The mask could never come off. Not in public. Not in private. Not even in death. When Elizabeth died, the performance did not end. It intensified. Her body was sealed quickly, wrapped, locked away. The questions were buried with it. Not because answers were impossible, but because answers were inconvenient. For over 400 years, Elizabeth's remains have remained untouched. Other monarchs have been examined, their skeletons scanned, their secrets measured, but not hers. And that refusal tells us more than any autopsy ever could. Because whatever lies beneath Westminster Abbey is not just bone. It is the physical truth of a woman who was never allowed to exist as one. If the legend of the Virgin Queen depends on never looking too closely, then perhaps the legend is more fragile than we admit. Perhaps the real danger is not what we might find. Perhaps the danger is what we already know. That Elizabeth survived by becoming something inhuman. That England prospered by demanding it. And that when her body finally failed, the evidence was locked away. So the symbol could live on. Elizabeth ruled England. But England ruled her body. It shaped it, disciplined it, consumed it, and then, when it was finished, England buried the proof. The real secret of Westminster Abbey is not what lies in the coffin. It is why we are still not allowed to look. Some truths are too dangerous to exhume. Some lies are too useful to abandon. And some bodies must remain buried, so empires can continue to believe in themselves. The Virgin Queen is dead, but the weapon she was forced to become is still very much alive. If this story unsettled you, it should have. Because history is not just about what happened, it is about what we choose to protect. Subscribe if you want history told, without comforting illusions, and ask yourself quietly, how many other legends survive? Only because no one is allowed to examine the body beneath them?